Yeah, so I'm excited that we got to sit down and chat that we could make it happen because you're actually living in Spain now.
Yes, as of I think it's like 2.5 weeks ago. So it was always my intention for a very, very long time. Like all my friends who know me know that I've been talking about this for ages. But it did take a long time, the whole process, to actually get the paperwork in order to. So I'm now in Madrid in the middle of August, which is possibly one of the most foolish things I've done is to try and move house when it's like about 50 degrees outside.
I know, sort of your background is you're from Australia. You were working in the UK for a long while. Sort of the bulk of your career, right, has been in the UK. So, did you get into Spanish wine in Australia? And if so, sort of what are your first memories of these first steps in the world of Spain?
The answer is no. I really knew nothing about Spanish wine when I was in Australia. And to be honest, it's still a super niche market. Things are happening there now. And I'm part of a group called Eat Spanish, which is really exciting, where we're trying to promote Spanish food. And obviously, I'm the wine voice in that. No, I was into wine in Australia, and my parents, would drag me and my sister around to wineries when we were little, traveling between Sydney and Melbourne. And I guess, at that point you hate it because it's really boring. But, there are certain things I remember from that too. So I think it kind of got under my skin. So no, I actually started out working in wine in France. So I lived in Bordeaux for 2 years and eventually ended up working there in the syndicate for Bordeaux Superior Wines.
Hmm.
Um, and I always thought I'd actually end up going back to live in the southwest of France, which I still absolutely adore. It's one of my favorite places.
Yeah, sure.
Actually, yeah, it's gorgeous. But actually, it was when I was there that I first got my taste of Spain. And I remember driving down from Bordeaux to San Sebastian, as people in Bordeaux do. And I just fell in love with the tapas culture and the wine. And so that was my first taste of Spain, actually.
So then since, this is the Wines of Galicia channel, let's narrow that down to Galicia then. Do you remember sort of your first experience of Galician wine?
Yeah, well, it would have been really early on in my buying career when I was buying wine in the UK. Probably one of my really early trips to Spain. But yeah, I do remember. And one of the things that struck me so much was just how different Galicia looked and felt and tasted compared to the rest of Spain, which, at that point, I didn't really know Spain that well. I was still discovering it, but I traveled a little bit around sort of the sherry country. I think by then I'd probably been to Rioja, done quite a bit of travel through central Spain, La Mancha, and then I went to Galicia, and the whole look, the approach to people, the whole feel of it was completely different. And I think that was one of the earliest times I realized just the amazing diversity and rich culture within all parts of Spain. So it was a really exciting trip for me.
Well, it is really amazing because you go and I mean, one of the first things that you sort of have to say about Galicia is that it's green Spain and that the rest of Spain, the conception that we have is this sort of dry, like man of La Mancha with the windmills and the hay fields and whatever. And then you go and it's like, oh, there's someone playing bagpipes when you walk into the Obradoiro in Santiago. And there's, it looks like Ireland or Scotland or this sort of Celtic thing. Yeah.
Even then, like the difference between, the Basque country and Galicia, even it's enormous. But yeah, no, absolutely. It's that lovely northern, cool Spain.
I always say that Spain is a país de países, right? Like it's a country of countries, sort of, that you go from one point to another and it's like night and day, which is one of the beautiful things because you don't really get that in a lot of modern Europe. Spain is still kind of like a little bit like the Wild West, sort of, I think, when it comes to these different regions, and they still have such a strong regional identity.
I think so. And I think what's really interesting is that certainly in my experience, I'm talking about the wine world, but also outside of the wine world, people don't realize that. I think that their
Yeah.
image of Spain is really quite dictated by, well, all of the cliches really, but I think it's really dictated by that sort of Andalusian flamenco, and coastal Spain, Costa Brava.
Yeah.
So people don't realize just the rich history and how diverse and disparate the country is.
So let's go back to that first taste of Galicia then. Do you remember what the wine was like, 15, 16 years ago, what your first impressions were?
I was actually thinking about chatting to you before this, and so many things I wanted to talk about involved red wine, which seems really weird given that so much of the production of Galicia is white wine. But it's pertinent to this question because one of the first things I remember actually was going to a pulperia and being given pig's ears and local red wine in a carafe, which was just, you know, if I had have had hairs on my chest, that would have ripped them off. It was just the most undrinkable thing. Like I often use in my tasting notes rustic in a nice sense. Like I love it when a wine has sort of a rusticity, it's charming, it's sort of really authentic. This was just awful. So I do remember that quite distinctly, but I think at the time, Albarino hadn't gone through its big boom phase yet. It was still on the radar. People were drinking a lot of it in foreign markets, and obviously it was huge in Galicia itself. And I'm talking just about Albarino because I think at that point, you know, Ribeiro hadn't gone through the wonderful reinvention of itself that it has now, and the other regions were just too small to be on the radar for most people. But I think, you know, obviously there were some of the really famous names, the ones who'd already made a name for themselves overseas, really classic producers. But there hadn't sort of been that underswell of, you know, smaller producers doing really interesting things. So I think for me, you know, I loved the wine. It was delicious, but I never really thought of it as having the complexities and the quality that I think, you know, we're witnessing today, for instance.
So what changed then? Where would you say, if you had to, I mean, I know it's hard to pin down, right? But if you had to look back and say this was the inflection point where Galicia sort of stepped into the pantheon of legitimate, you know, for lack of a better word, wine regions, that it began to be sort of in the to be talked about. When was that point?
I mean, I've seen those changes in terms of the quality of the wine and what's being produced there over you know, such a period of time now, 15, 16 years. I mean, I think Albarino was a little bit earlier in terms of really going through an explosion overseas and people realizing its potential. But in terms of the other region and the other regions and the other varieties within Galicia, I think it was probably 6, 7 years ago that people started to go, well, hey, what's going on here? And for me, it's sort of part of a bigger movement of what I've witnessed in Spain during that same period of time across, you know, all various regions. And I think it comes down to, it's various things. And I always find it really hard to put this into words, but maybe a little bit more sense of belief in what the growers realized that they actually had, and the winemakers, what their natural resources. I think that there's a whole generation of winemakers. I like to call them young, but I'm actually really talking about people about my age, so not that young, but maybe let's say between, I don't know, you know, 30 and 50 or 35 and up to, you know, maybe 45, 50. That generation of winemakers had gone away, whether it was outside of their region in Spain to get experience in other places or traveled to other parts of the world. And they brought that knowledge back, but rather than just applying sort of international standards, which is, I think, what happened. You know, if we look at the 1990s, for instance, into 2000s in Spain, there was a necessity to clean up a lot of the winemaking and modernize it and take it into the next century. But in doing that, it's sort of, it didn't lose identity. It just turned it into something that was a little bit more international, perhaps in character. But this generation of winemakers, I think, brought back a lot of confidence in their own abilities and realized what they actually had. And so there was, Una Vuelta al Pasado, is, you know, this wonderful return to the past. And so when I'm tasting wines, whether it's Galicia or the rest of Spain, some of the wines that I love the most are actually so far removed from what people's idea of that region is outside of Spain. But it's actually the authentic character of the region that always was before the wines became a little bit more internationalized. So I could see that happening a lot in Galicia as well. If we take a region like Ribeiro, which, you know, during the second half of the 20th century, you know, it did provide a lot of volume, particularly to supermarkets. It relied on a lot of the palomino that was planted. It was seen as quite sort of a cheap option. And a lot of the vineyards were planted then on the lower areas around the river. And what I've seen gradually over the last 15 years is people moving up into the slopes, into really interesting vineyard areas, and putting a lot more value on the old vines of the local grapes like Treixadura and Godello. And I think for me, it's just having that confidence to return to Spain's true viticultural heritage and to value the amazing vineyards and terroir that there is here.
I think also in general, Spain people, if we're painting with a broad brush here, have an inferiority complex still about Spanish wine. There's always sort of this comparison, well, the French are doing this or the Italians are doing this.
I totally understand that inferiority complex.
Yeah.
It's actually putting a value on what's here. It's something as simple as like, please don't put Grenache on the label, put Garnacha. It's a Spanish variety, you know, really simple things like that. But I've seen quite big changes over the last few years, which hopefully I think means it's heading in the right direction.
Where do you see the next sort of 10 to 15 years of Galicia?
I think it's really exciting. I think that we're only really just starting to see the potential of the region. I mean, there are still huge swathes of the region which haven't been recuperated yet. So if you take an example like Ribera Sacra, obviously there's been a lot of work to recuperate the old vines, but it's such a difficult, challenging landscape that there are entire, you know, like other side of the other mountain slopes, other hillsides on the other side of the river that are just still completely abandoned. So, and also with that recuperation process that's taken place in a lot of the regions, or replanting, like in Ribeiro, for instance, you know, that's all really positive, but we haven't really seen the fruits of all of that yet. So, and people are still feeling their way. And I think in terms of trying to work out what is the actual style of of certain areas and certain subzones, you know, obviously so many people outside of Spain know Rías Baixas and Albariño, but even there's so much now to talk about. I mean, Salnés really has nothing to do with Condado do Tea in terms of wine styles or viticulture or terroir. But, you know, that's really the next step. And how do we explain that to people? How do we explain to people the other DOs within Galicia? And also, one of the big things that I'm really keen to keep promoting is the concept of ageability of these wines.
Oh, yes.
Because, you know, it's a victim of its own success. If we look at the case of Albariño, that everybody loves it, they want to drink it. But we shouldn't really be touching the majority of it until at least after year in bottle, because that's really only when it starts to show its full potential and it's an amazing wine. And then after that, you know, you can say, well, you could leave it for 5-10 years. And some of the older vintages are incredible. And I've seen that happen as well with some of the better examples of Trexadura and blends in Ribeiro. It's, you know, starting to try and explain to people that these are lovely, young, fresh wines, but actually we're talking about a region that has the potential to be one of the greatest white wine regions in the world. Yeah. And then obviously there's interesting reds and things that we can talk about in terms of how people can actually achieve the best style for the region.
A word that I tend to use in a lot of my conversations about Galicia is cortoplacismo, or short-term thinking. So it's sort of, you know, once you've let the genie out of the bottle with, oh, it's fresh, it's fruity, you drink it, you know, vino del año, you drink it in the year, it's really hard to get that back once it's been so ingrained. So I think I agree with you that that's one of the challenges that we sort of have for consumers, but also for the wine world in general, to say, hey, age your Albariño or age your Trexadura or whatever. So, you know, speaking of, I don't know if it's broken into the mainstream, you know, outside of Galicia yet, but there's this movement kind of bubbling under the surface of classification, right? Of a sort of Priorat, Bierzo style pyramidal classification of vineyards, of, you know, vino de villa, vino de paraje, whatever. Do you see that as sort of this worthy cause of championing right now in Galicia?
Yeah, it's a really big question, and I've sort of got my own conflicting views on it as well. If you take an example of Bierzo, for instance, I think what they did there was fabulous and it's working incredibly well. And I think that that's going to have a lot of potential for the region. But there's one key thing that I think Bierzo did better than have other regions have tried to roll it out. And that's it. Basically, they used the local knowledge and used the boundaries of the parajes and the single vineyard sites that people were already using. So they didn't try to implement a system. So from the very beginning, it sort of made sense. It was like, well, this is already what we have. What we're going to do is try and put some more value onto it and explain to people, if you get a wine with a paraje name and you know that it comes from Valle de Abajo, and you start to understand some of the characteristics of that area. So I think that's a really good way of approaching it. So it's probably far too early to look at a really rigid system in some of the smaller DOs in Galicia. But if we looked at Rias Baixas, I think that there's probably more value in starting to call out specific areas within the subzones and to be able to label a little bit more specifically about where the vineyard's actually planted. So as long as it wasn't a rigid system, you know, and it could sort of grow organically, I think there's value if it reflects what's already happening.
You hit the nail on the head there, because for a lot of, I know for a lot of growers and sommeliers and people involved in wine, it's very frustrating that you'll still go, you said the pulperia or whatever, and you'll drink out of the cunca, the ceramic thing. And on the menu, they'll have Dio Godello, because people say, oh, Albarino, and they think Rias Baixas, but they don't really know, or they'll say, you know, Dio Mencia. There's still kind of this confusion. And, you know, really the average consumer outside of Galicia or Spain is not necessarily going to know, you know, the sort of minutia.
But then there's a level of consumer and within the trade as well, where that does become important if you want to try and put value and into a region and create an image of quality.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think it's you know, they're driven to create this image of quality, but at the same time, from the DO level, from a marketing perspective, if we take Ribeiro, for example, right? From a marketing perspective, they say, well, Albarino is the grape of Rias Baixas, right? And then Valdeorras, other DO over there, they have Godello. And Ribeira Sacra, they have Mencia. So what does Ribeiro have? Well, we have Treixadura. And so we need to sort of market this based on the grape, because consumers, they'll order a Pinot Noir or they'll order a Cabernet Sauvignon. They order by grape variety, right? So I think it's interesting that from the DO perspective, they're pushing that. And then from the sort of trade sommelier producer perspective, they're really pushing for this classification. So it'll be interesting to see in the next few years where the two meet.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't have to exclude one for the other. But one thing that I would love to see before possibly even all of that is a lot more work done as a whole region, as Galicia. And I've got in trouble for saying this before with certain DOs because I've been told, well, Rias Baixas is not Ribeiro. And I'm like, yeah, I know, but nobody outside knows that. And an example that I always use is the Sud de France. And I think the Sud de France does a really good job at marketing in terms of a whole package. So obviously there are loads of appellations within the south of France. Then you've got the tourism, the food, you know, everything together. And I think that Galicia is possibly missing a trick. And I've seen some steps heading in the right direction, you know, at wine fairs and things where they're now working a little bit more together as a Galician stand. But I think there's massive potential there that hasn't been tapped into, where a lot more work could be done to sell the region as a whole.
There are all sorts of financial difficulties and political machinations and everything that you unfortunately have to deal with there. But I think, yeah, one thing that I think about a lot is cross-regional promotion. I think that, yeah, if they banded together, you sort of need to, well, it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, that you have to step outside of this Spanish or Galician perspective and sort of see things from the consumer or the trade professional from the rest of the world, that they're going to say, oh, Galicia. They're not necessarily going to say, oh, you're from, you know, Carballiño. Oh, of course I know that. What do you think about, you know, what do you think are some of the most pressing issues right now in Galician wine, in Galicia?
Oh, as I said, a lot of the region is just at the point where I think it's going to become really, really exciting. There are a lot of people, I think, within the trade who already think that some of the things happening there are really exciting, but I don't think that the wines necessarily have quite hit their mark yet. So I think there's a tendency to accept quite leafy green red wines as, oh, that's the regional style. We actually know that they're just green and they're too edgy, and they don't need to be, because I can name a handful of excellent examples which aren't like that. So, and I think as well around some of the white wine styles that are coming out, you know, a lot plays around the question of oak or aging, skin contact. I think that people are still trying to find their way with that. And some people have their own inherent house styles and they do that very well. And other people are trying to follow certain other wineries. So I think it's just giving the people on the ground there the time to, you know, work with all the progress that's happened over the last 10, 15 years in the actual viticultural side, but, you know, start to find their own identity. And I think we as a trade need to be quite conscious of that and say, yes, it's a super exciting region, but not excuse interesting and different funky wines as being good when they're not actually quite up to the mark.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It's kind of one of those things where a region is finding its footing. So you do have a historical style, but half of this is an invention, right? You know, Ribera Sacra, the limitations of the geographical delimitations, it was sort of, you know, it's based in history, but when it was made, it was sort of arbitrary. Or like the Val de Salnés, for example, you could argue that certain things that were like the Morrazo Peninsula, right? When they made it, it was because they needed to have a certain percentage of real Albarino vinifera versus, you know, the hybrid direct producers, that kind of thing. So we've got to kind of press the producers. They're doing great, but as a trade, you have to press people to really think outside of themselves, out of their little perspective, but also to do better. Yeah. Well, we've come to the lightning round. So I'm going to ask you 6 questions and just answer, you know, on instant. Okay.
Okay.
All right, here we go. 3, 2, 1. Describe Galicia in 3 words.
The obvious is green, but we've already said that, but I'll go with it anyway. I always think it's quite mysterious. That probably needs a bit of explanation, but it's the clouds, it's the mountains, it's, you know, the landscape. And the other word I would say is changeable, but that's very specifically in relation to the weather.
A wine that changed your life.
I'm going to give a wine style rather than a specific wine. I'm going to say Chacolí. The reason I'm going to say that is, as I explained earlier, my first visit to Spain was to the Basque Country. I fell in love with Spain there, and you know, that very first glass being poured at the bar was Chacolí.
Favorite word in the Galician language?
I'm not great in Gallego. Can I claim Trexadura?
It is a word.
There we go.
A Galician wine that you really love right now.
Last night at dinner, I had 2 Galician wines. So I had the entry wine from Do Ferreiro, which I just love as a style. It's so clean, crystalline, saline, pure. And the other wine was the Escolma from Ribeiro, the red, which is just, I think, one of the best reds in the region. And it was just gorgeous.
Favorite place in Galicia?
I'm a beach girl. I love Vigo, actually. And the reason is because I've been visiting it for a long time, but I think it's changed so much during that period. I love the old town, and there's now a real kind of vibrancy and a great atmosphere there.
Why should people get to know Galician wines?
What I would say is get to know them now, because I think as much as we've seen amazing wines come out of Galicia in the last 10, 15 years, it's only going to get more exciting. So get to know the region now, get in on the ground floor with some of the wineries before, you know, they become cult classics, because I think the next 10 years is going to be super exciting.
Great.